My wife and I are absolute ramen fiends, but we don't always want like a fatty, porky bowl. Sometimes we want something a little bit healthier. This is an iteration of a spicy miso ramen that replaces any sort of meat with mushroom. It is so good, so rich, so delicious, so creamy. You're not even gonna miss any meat with it. Here's how to make it. To start, we're gonna make a dashi packed with as much umami as possible. To keep this vegan, we won't be using any katsuobushi or dried bonito flakes. In lieu of the fish product, we're gonna use dried shiitake. These pack a ton of flavor and are gonna help boost the umami of the kombu. Let's bring 800 mils of water to a simmer and add your dried mushrooms. Let this simmer for like 10 minutes and then shut off the heat. At this point, we can add our kombu and cover it. Boiling kombu creates a ton of bitter flavors, so keep this below boiling. As long as you do that, you're gonna end up with a dashi that's full of delicate fragrance and a huge backbone of umami from that kombu. After another 10 minutes or so, the kombu should be softened, which is a telltale sign that it's given all of its goodness. Remove the mushrooms and set those aside for later. I like to pour the dashi through a sieve with a paper towel to create like a makeshift filter. Any bits of mushroom or kombu that have broken off are just gonna catch on the paper. I know it's an extra step compared to using granules or like a soup base, but it's worth it because it gives us these reconstituted, rehydrated dried mushrooms that are gonna have a second life in a minute. Trust me, you're gonna be happy you did this. Before we begin cooking the beautiful spicy miso broth, we need to prep some aromatics. For the oniony backbone, we'll use one large spring onion or a handful of your standard green onions. It's spring in Seattle, so there are a lot of like fun onion varietals, but use what you can find. Separate the top green portions from the whites and set aside large chunks of the greens. We're gonna be frying those whole, so leave those into big pieces. For the whites, I saw a cool technique where you make a bunch of almost poke cuts into the stalks and turn it as you go. This creates a really fine mince when you go to cut it. We also need 2 cloves of minced garlic along with a knob of ginger that's roughly equal to the amount of garlic. The garlic and ginger bring a bunch of fragrance that really make a difference here. I think the ginger is actually really important here. Every now and then you get a bite with like a little bit more ginger and it gives this just punch of almost like citrusy brightness to help with all of that rich, fatty broth that we're making. I like to include some crispy sauteed mushrooms as a topping, and these shiitake looked really nice. It's about 100 grams or so. I'll slice these into large pieces, and you're gonna wanna make these larger than you actually think they're gonna end up because they're gonna shrink tremendously. Set these aside for now as we're gonna need them later. Now remember those dried mushrooms we used for the dashi? Well, those aren't so dry anymore. In fact, cooking them in the dashi has given them a beautifully meaty texture that we can use in lieu of ground pork. They've got a ton of delicious depth that goes really well as a meat replacement in the broth. Slice your pieces into matchsticks and then turn them 90 degrees and cut them into a dice. Continue running your knife through the pieces, kind of using like a rocking cut, so you end up with something that's gonna integrate more easily into the soup. If the pieces are too large, and especially if you're not a mushroom person, you can end up with like these big chewy bites, and you don't really want that. The chewy texture is really nice when it's fine and small, not as good when you get like a really big piece of it, so just break it down really fine. You could probably use a food processor for this, I just don't feel like getting one out for this. We can take all of these prepped ingredients over to the stove and get started on the broth. For this, we need a pot over medium heat, one that's large enough to hold all of your broth. It's also not a bad idea to get a pot of water boiling now, as we're gonna need it for our noodles later. Add in a big squeeze of cooking oil, probably like 15 mils or so, and then add the green parts from the onions that we cut earlier. We're gonna cook these until they take on a nice brown color. This is gonna flavor the oil and create this like soft, subtle, sweet onion note. Once deeply browned, remove the greens and add in your chopped mushrooms. These are gonna have a ton of liquid that needs to be cooked out before they even begin to brown, so give them the right amount of time. If you need a little bit more oil, feel free to add a little more, and just keep moving these around as they cook, and you're gonna notice the smell change once the browning occurs. It goes from that like woodsy mushroom smell to something that's much deeper and richer. It's like being on the outside of a forest versus being in the deep, dark center of one. As those really begin to brown, add in your onion whites, garlic, and ginger so that those can cook out as well. We'll need these raw flavors cooked out so nothing is too harsh or kind of like pointy in the end. After a minute or two, the pot should be smelling amazing. So now you can add 25 grams of doubanjiang and fry that slightly before adding a splash of sake, just enough to deglaze the pan. Once the brown bits have all been scraped up, add in your dashi. Mix this to combine and set this over medium-low to sort of hang out and mellow while we make the toppings. Corn is a really easy, nice topping, and honestly, I always keep frozen corn around, and it can just be lightly sauteed with a little bit of oil and salt until it's just warmed through. This goes really well on a bowl of miso ramen. For those sliced mushrooms, get a saute pan over medium-high and add in a touch of oil. Drop in your mushrooms to the hot pan and season these with salt now to help draw out the moisture. I cover this really in depth in my mushroom video for people who don't like mushrooms at all. If you're somebody who really hates them, give that video a watch and come back and finish this ramen one. These are gonna need a good amount of time for the water trapped inside the mushrooms to escape and cook away. Once that happens, the browning can start to occur. There's pretty much no way to overcook a mushroom, so I like to cook these until they're really deeply browned and crunchy. This usually takes like 7 to 15 minutes, depending on how hot and the size of your mushroom pieces. Remove them from the pan once they've browned to your liking. Although these aren't required, it's a nice touch to have a little bit of a different texture with this bowl. Lastly, finely slice a bunch of green onion along with a couple sheets of nori as that sort of final finishing touch. Okay, back to the broth. We can take our 75 grams of red miso and mix it with just a little bit of water to create a paste that's gonna more easily incorporate into the broth. The miso is what's gonna make this broth super creamy and flavorful and salty, so use a good tasting one. I tried it with white miso and that worked really well, but I actually preferred the flavor of red miso more for this. It's a little bit less salty and a little bit more deep, and for the case of this ramen, I really enjoy that. Season this with a splash of soy sauce and mirin for that final hit of umami and sweetness, and then go ahead and taste it for seasoning. You're just gonna wanna make sure that it's got the right salt levels to mix well with the noodles that we're gonna make. At the same time, we can add our noodles to boiling water and set a 4-minute timer. If you're using a noodle that's different from the one that I've got here, just go with the directions on the package. Once the 4 minutes is up, drain your noodles and run them under cold water to stop the cooking process. To plate these beautiful bowls, split your noodles between 2 bowls and then top each one with half of the broth. Be sure to get all of those chopped mushrooms that are in the broth distributed evenly between the 2 bowls. Lastly, top the bowls with the nori, the crispy mushrooms, the corn, and the green onions. A little cracked pepper on the corn looks really nice, but overall, this is like stellar on its own. The first time my wife and I tried this, we were like taken aback at how much this covered our ramen cravings and then some. It is everything you want in a bowl. It's got that spice, it's got the creaminess, it's vegan, and it can help us feel a little bit healthier. For Earth Day, my sister challenged everybody in the family to eat vegan for the night, and this was our answer to that. And it is absolutely delicious, and it's gonna warm your soul and you're gonna feel great about it. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here. Leave a comment on what your favorite type of ramen is. I may just make it in the future. Thank you so much to the amazing people supporting me directly on Patreon through patreon.com/CameronMarty. These are people who have decided my work is worth supporting financially. I get to keep the lights on and they get some cool benefits for supporting the channel. Check it out if you're interested in becoming a patron. Thanks again. Cheers.